What this book does is shows us how people who were on the other side of the Iron Curtain, I suppose, had these rich and meaningful relationships with media reporters and media then.
You're listening to the Transformative Podcast brought to you by the Research Center for the History of Transformations at the University of Vienna.
Hello, you're listening to the Transformative Podcast of the Research Center for the History of Transformations. My name is Jelena Đureinović. In this episode, we are talking about radio in Czechoslovakia during state socialism. My guest today is Dr. Rosamund Johnston, a postdoc researcher and my colleague at the University of Vienna, whose book Red Tape, Radio and Politics in Czechoslovakia, 1945 to 1969, was just published with Stanford University Press. Hi, Rosie. Thank you for coming today. And first of all, congratulations on the book.
Thank you very much. It's wonderful to talk about it and be on this side of the podcast for a change.
So for the beginning, a simple question. Why radio? Besides radio obviously being the most dominant media format in the decades after the Second World War, what does radio as a lens tell us about state socialism and post-1945 history of Czechoslovakia?
Well, I think it tells us a lot, and I think that the dominance isn't to be, I suppose, kind of understated, right? So coming out of World War II, both politicians are saying, radio is the medium to which we want to give news first. And audiences are writing in the largest number to state radio of all of the media institutions when they somehow want to address politicians. So I think that, from these different directions, that dominance might look a little bit different, but radio is the dominant one for both of those constituencies. But I think besides that, looking at radio in Czechoslovakia shows us some particular things. One, I would argue throughout this early socialist period that radio is a state institution that often people somehow enjoy or are happy to be in contact with. And I think we've got some really, really good histories of state institutions such as the police or, the justice system that people didn't want to be in contact with at all. And I think this presents us a history of the same time, but kind of capturing a rather different relationship to state institutions from that period. And I think that this is not in any way Czechoslovak specific. I think that looking at radio is a really, really good example of the shock of the old, which is a term penned by a historian of technology, David Edgerton, to describe technologies really when they're kind of at their peak. So very often when people write histories of technologies, they really focus on the new. And when people talk about technologies, there's a big kind of fetishization almost of the new. But he argues that, most people can only afford a technology by the time it's actually not all that new. So you find with histories of radio that there are a lot of them written about the interwar period and certainly World War II, but actually it's people from really different generations. Oldest, youngest people are having meaningful connection with radio precisely in this 40s, 50s and 60s moment. And that tells us something about kind of engagement with technology really cross society that I don't think you get with these earlier histories of radio.
In the book, you focus on radio reporters and journalists and their role beyond being just messengers of state politics, of course, and as balancing between maintaining socialism on the one hand, and then on the other, of course, criticizing it from within regime's own institutions. Can you tell me something more about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So journalists, I would say, are the kind of most important constituency. I mentioned before listeners and politicians, and journalists are always in dialogue with both politicians and their listeners. But if this book is about one set of people, it is, as you say, socialist journalists who definitely we're talking from within the socialist system. Very often these are card-carrying members of the Communist Party and convinced communists too, right? This is not late socialism where maybe the argument can be made that this is mere opportunism and people don't really think what they're saying. In the 40s and 50s and 60s, I would argue, and looking at these journalists, I think it's really kind of possible to show that these people wrote what they thought. They really felt strongly about the building of socialism and its improvement throughout the 1960s in Czechoslovakia. But I think what I argue in this book is kind of against a propagandistic understanding of socialist media, because I think that when we've thought about the total output of socialist media as propaganda before, we've kind of done journalists a bit of a disservice, and we've understated their influence in the kind of setting of the terms of this medium in the first place. So definitely journalists produced propaganda, and there were big debates between journalists and their listeners about what propaganda was. Propaganda was a word used in Czechoslovakia, and it meant bad journalism. So there was some back and forth about, what journalism was good and bad, and journalists were very active in those debates. And they were also debating this with politicians too, I should say. But what journalists were doing that I think a propaganda paradigm doesn't show us is they were setting some of the terms of what socialism could be and the rhetorical kind of framework of socialism. So specifically, redefining one's relationship to socialism after the death of Stalin, defining what the political reform of the Prague Spring might look like. This was largely a journalist-led initiative that politicians themselves then sort of took on and started to use the same terms. So I see when one looks at socialist media and specifically socialist radio, journalists as being the single most important constituency when it comes to setting the terms of that medium. Always in discussion, of course, with censors and with ideological commissions of the Communist Party.
What about the listeners? How did they engage with radio as a medium, but also what kind of relationships did they have with reporters that you were just talking about?
Well, the best way I can get at listener relationships, which may not be sort of the most accurate overall, is looking at fan mail. And the reason it's not necessarily the most accurate overall is because not everyone writes letters to radio stations, or not everyone writes letters to their favourite newspapers. But what I do have and what I do look at for this book is thousands and thousands of pieces of fan mail that people did over those 20 years write to people, sometimes asking, will you marry me? Sometimes writing beautiful poems of appreciation for the journalism that they heard either from these celebrity reporters Zygmunt and Hanzelka, or in the 1960s, this very charismatic and impressive foreign correspondent Věra Šťovíčková and the way that she was broadcasting during the Prague Spring. Of course, there are complaints in there too. This is not just a kind of happy, harmonious story. And there's some quite sort of disturbing ones to read. So anti-Semitic diatribes. But I would say letter writing was a meaningful form of engagement and gives us some sort of bottom-up picture of the way that some listeners did engage with state media during the socialist period. And it certainly shows us that many of them liked it. But I would say that over and beyond that, there are less direct ways to get at listener experience. News reports tell us certain things. Again, the aforementioned celebrity reporters, Zygmunt and Hanzelka, were nearly stampeded when they arrived in Zlín in the 1950s by their female fans. That tells us something about how people are responding to celebrities they've heard on the radio. And then in this really interesting case in 1968, Věra Šťovíčková broadcast about arms dealing in Nigeria, and that sparks protests, and we know that from newspapers outside of the foreign ministry in Prague. So, and then I suppose the other thing is some published diaries and some unpublished diaries also give us really interesting feedback or insight into how people listen to the radio. So I have one example, I don't write about it as much as I think it should be written about, of someone who went on to be a country musician who just listened to Radio Luxembourg and all of the charts during the 50s, and he'd write down things like, this is a rubbish song. So, that shows me, and, there's some bits where he's trying to write down the name of the song and he can't because he can't hear the name of the song properly. So that tells me something about, how radio must have sounded and how then that was translated by the listener into, a structured bit of listening knowledge.
Yeah, the book is also because of that a great example of the diversity of sources when it comes to studying radio as a medium. But let's move on maybe to the transnational perspective of your book, because of course the Czechoslovak radio, as any other, did not exist in isolation. And also radio broadcasting and listening, as you show in the book, were always kind of a transborder thing. How did radio relate to the foreign policy of Czechoslovakia, for example?
So I would say that we see in the sort of first 2 decades of the book a disconnect between official political ideas of what foreign radio matters and listeners' ideas of, which stations matter. So to put this quite concretely, always for the Politburo, evil foreign radio station number 1 is Radio Free Europe, which is broadcasting from West Germany, the United States, in Czech and Slovak. But what I find through looking at listener letters to many of those ministers, as well as listener polling conducted by Radio Free Europe itself, listeners very often talk about their experiences of listening to Austria and German language radio as being the most meaningful interactions that they're having with foreign radio at exactly this same time. So what I would say is that actually by looking at foreign radio and the ways that people are listening to foreign radio, we do see a certain disconnect between policymakers and their idea of the Cold War and what the Cold War looks like and what the West looks like, and listeners themselves. But what I would say, to go back to these reporters, which we discussed as being kind of the central group of this book, you do see a kind of change in time when you look at the biographies of these reporters themselves, whereby they seem to, over the 2 decades in question, have more and more of a sense that they are, through radio, experts and experts on Czechoslovakia and experts on Czechoslovakia's place in the world. And certainly by 1968, I focus on foreign correspondents, and a couple of them in particular, this Africa reporter Věra Šťovíčková goes as far as attempting to shape foreign ministry policy on Africa on the basis of her radio expertise. So I think that this is important because in the same way that we've generally understated the influence of radio journalists, I think we've generally understated the influence of like Czechoslovakia, like having a foreign policy at all, an independent foreign policy of its own. So in 1968, well, you definitely see Czechoslovak foreign politicking in Africa, and you definitely see people beyond the Politburo really attempting to shape that.
And at the end of the book, what I found particularly interesting and important, you also reflect on the contemporary implications of the study of Cold War radio. Can you maybe somehow tell us briefly how can this help us better understand aspects of today's media environment?
For sure. So I think that there are clear parallels. So of course, the media environment has fundamentally changed. You know, not all of us are tuning in nightly to radio anymore. Of course, that's the case. But what I think that we can see better through this book and through this study is how and why people meaningfully engaged with media that weren't trying in any way to be liberal in the past. All of the reporters that I mentioned here were producing, at times, propaganda. They certainly were working in censored environments, and they certainly would not have referred to themselves as liberals. And they fostered, on the basis of the kind of back and forth that they had with their listeners that I described through fan mail, through debates about propaganda, through debates about what socialism should be, relationships, I would say, that were kind of based on respect and trust. And I think that what this book does is shows us how people, you know, who were on the other side of the Iron Curtain, I suppose, had these kind of rich and meaningful relationships with media reporters and media then. And I think that you can use the same schema to understand how people might, on other ends of the political spectrum, have rich and meaningful relationships with media that is not trying to be liberal now. And I think that what's important here is that it shows that those who seem to be involved in diametrically opposed media listening practices are actually doing exactly the same thing as you. So I think that's maybe quite important because we are so polarizing sometimes in the way that we discuss media and media consumption now. And I think this offers us a way to not polarize those who don't have the same media tastes as us. And last thing I would say is I think that this book amply shows that all media are social media, and therefore, you know, we're not in a uniquely unknowable age or a uniquely problematic age, and we can look to the fairly recent past for some good clues about how media works and, you know, how people relate to media.
And with this contemporary outlook, we are coming to the end of our today's conversation on radio and politics in Czechoslovakia. This was the transformative podcast of the Research Center for the History of Transformations with Rosamund Johnston and Jelena Đureinović.